which we are going through the Lord's Prayer, or the Our Father, whatever you prefer. And we're kind of going through it line by line. And I think the purpose of this is to experience and to uncover an uncommon vitality in your prayer life, and ones that we often miss. And I would have to say, I am one of those people. Some people I remember for years I would hear from the pulpit just being gotta be a prayer warrior, love prayer. And for me, it always felt like a chore, and it didn't quite it didn't quite resonate with me. And I've struggled with prayer. So if you're one of those people who struggle with prayer and you're God, I need you to teach me about prayer, this is for you. Or if you're one of those people who love to pray but you want to go deeper, this is also for you. There's an unlimited amount of richnesses in this. And Jesus gave us this prayer not only so that we could pray it, and it is a complete prayer. It is probably the most complete prayer that we could ever pray. Anything that you could probably pray is in this prayer. It's a total prayer. But yet underneath it, you could just say it and it would be good. But underneath it, it gives us a method of prayer and teaches us about prayer more specifically in different types of prayer if you take time to kind of meditate on it. So that's what we're doing. We're meditating on these methods of prayer so that we can go deeper in our prayer life. And last week we looked at the second kind of set of your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And this kind of forms a hinge in the prayer. The beginning part of the prayer is you notice the pronouns here. There is your name, your kingdom, your will. And then you have our on earth as it is in heaven. And then it goes, give us, forgive us, lead us, and deliver us. So it switches. It goes from your to us. And I think that's intentional. So this is kind of we're in a transitional point. And so we're going to be kind of going into the second half of the prayer where we're going to start looking at the us's. And so today we're going to be looking at give us this day our daily bread. And as we did last week and the week previously, I would like us all to say the prayer together. And we'll be reading it from the NIV, which is in the pewbacks. And it's going to be on page 96. And it'll be in Matthew 6, chapter 6, verses 9 through 13. What? 960. Oh, sorry, 960. There's just a lot of even in the Matthew, it's 6:9, so there's just forgive me. All right. I'll start off with then this is how you should pray, and then you can join me with the Our Father. This then is how you should pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. All right. So I'm gonna take a kind of hard left here. I'm gonna talk about the gym. One of the best things that my gym offers is that I get 2 free hours of childcare a day. It's awesome. I love it. And it really, really helps me be consistent. And because usually at least once a week I need to take my kids to care. And so I usually am often taking the kids with me to the gym. Now the problem with the Y is this, especially the one downtown, there's no parking. If you've ever gone down there, if you've ever worked out there, if you've ever visited it out, there's no parking. There's 3 tiny lots and there's lots of people that go down there and they're always fighting for spots. So you either do this, one of 2 things. You have to pay for street parking. And sometimes you have to walk a while if you have to like park kind of far away. Or two, you just like go in loops, okay? And then you just kind of drive around. I personally just like to pay for parking, and as much as Heather hates it, and she's like, that's not in our budget. And I'm like, but I have time. I don't have unlimited time to just like keep driving around this parking lot. Well, the other day, I was driving to the Y, and this happened just like recently, and it was just like pouring rain, just buckets of rain, and I was like, and in the back of my mind, I was like, okay, I wonder what's parking going to be like today? And so, it's just like raining so hard, and as we pull up, how I drive in, I can kind of have a feeling. I'm like, oh, it's going to be one of those days where I'm like going to have a hard time finding parking. And it was one of those days because as I was driving down, I could see that they blocked off most of the street parking as well, thanks to construction in the rain. And I was like, oh no. And I had both of my kids I had Beatrice and Wendell with me and like a whole bunch of stuff. And I was gonna go like from here to the office. So I had like 500 bags. And I was like, I have to like carry this all in the rain. And I was like, this is not gonna be good. And then as I'm thinking this, I kind of I let out a huge sigh. And then, because I'm just like, I'm just gonna walk in the rain, and it's gonna be terrible, and then the kids are gonna be wet, and it's not gonna be good. But then after I let out the huge sigh, I hear Beatrice come from behind me. She's like, dear God, help us get a parking space. Because she always hears me complain about the parking. And I was like, and as we pull up, we go into the main parking lot, and lo and behold, we get like one of the prime spots right in front of the door. And I was like, oh, that's awesome. And somebody was like pulling out just as I was pulling in, so I was like, I didn't even have to like walk very far, and I was like, oh, what a relief. Now, Beatrice, in her childlike way, had no problem asking for God for a parking spot, okay? It was her first response. She was just like she knows that there's never parking, you could see that it was like really terrible, and she was like, I'm just gonna ask God for a parking spot. Mine, on the other hand, was not that. I am not as holy as my child. I was just kind of like figuring, I'm like, okay, like what am I gonna do? How am I gonna problem solve this? And it actually never occurred to me that I should just pray for a parking spot. Because it seemed so common and so insignificant. Because in the back of my mind, surely the God of the universe has bigger problems to solve than my parking. I looked at the New York Times that day, and the headlines are filled with problems that by far grieve God's heart way more than my parking problems. Things like the brutal killing of Christians who have in the DRC, that 70 people were murdered. That grieves God's heart tremendously. Or the starvation in Yemen due to a civil war, or all the stuff that's going on in Israel and Gaza, and then there's Ukraine, and then, there's the drug epidemic, and the list could go on and on and on. And surely those matter more, right? Surely. God's listening to those prayers. And my parking problems are literally the least of his concerns. It's such a kind of a first world problem to being like, I have to suffer being damp from walking in a block in the rain to go work out, right? I have to physically push myself and exert myself because I live such a cushy life nowadays. Because it's people 100 years ago didn't really go to the gym because they didn't need to, because our lives are so easy. While literally there's girls who can't go to school because they have to walk 12 miles to fetch water for their families. And I'm like, man, but while I was having these kind of thoughts after Beatrice said her prayer, as I was reflecting on this kind of experience, I thought, I'm probably not alone here, right? I'm not alone in thinking these thoughts. How many of us at some point said, I'm not going to pray for X because what I'm dealing with isn't actually a big deal to God? And I think it really highlights an assumption that we have when it comes to prayer. And I think this is really important. I think for a lot of us, we have a hierarchy of prayer that like there are certain forms of prayer that are more noble or better, and so we're gonna like pray for those things, or we're gonna like save our prayers for when they really matter. So there, like, what are some more noble prayers, right? I think that like just prayer of like worship and contemplation of God, just purely praying because God is good, just praying for just for the sake of God, or where we just like wait upon Him and we listen to Him. I think that like we do that here as friends, or there's like intercessory prayer where you are praying on the behalf of another person of their big concern because it matters to them, and you're like like that's really selfless and good. And these things can feel superior. And then we get to the kind of like the third kind of prayer, which is what theologians will call petitionary prayers. These are prayers that simply ask God for things, right? That we usually for ourselves. And in some ways, you could link that with intercessory prayer because often you're interceding on the behalf of other people to get something from God. But it's the asking prayer, asking God for all sorts of things. And what we see through the Gospels is, and I think we tend to downplay that kind of prayer in our personal life because we don't want to feel greedy, or maybe we don't want to like bother God or treat Him like a vending machine. But what we see throughout the Gospels is this: there is an insistence from Jesus that we ask God for all sorts of things all the time. And you have it later on in the Sermon on the Mount. It says, "Ask, seek, and knock, and it will be given to you." We are told several parables about the persistence of prayer, like the persistence of the widow, or even the friend that comes out in the middle of the night who like didn't have enough food for his friend, who like also is staying with him, and he used to be hospitable, so he like knocks on his neighbor's door because he was like caught unprepared, and he bothers his friend for a loaf of bread. And you're like that would just be like such a weird like scenario. And then Jesus says like this is about prayer. And what we see, and I think what we see in the Gospels and in the Scriptures is, Spurgeon observes, is this: whether we like it or not, asking is the rule of the kingdom, right? That the rule of the kingdom of heaven is predicated on us asking for things. Yet there's a hesitation, I think, on our part most of the time. And we tend, like I said, only ask God for things when things get really bad. Like, I don't know if you've ever, like, you just go through life and you're just, like, totally fine. But then when, like, stuff hits the fan and you're, like, everything's crashing down, that's when your prayer life goes, like, I'm going to, like, diligently pray, like, all the time. But then when things go good again, you're just kind of like, da-da-da-da-da, and, like, don't ever really think about God. Like, I've been there. I don't know if you've ever been there. But there is a sense in which, like, sometimes when life gets really hard, we get closer to God. And because we're shown that we have our need. But then when we have our needs fulfilled, we tend to kind of like forget about God. Or we only save it for the big asks. We don't want to bother the big guy upstairs. And Richard Foster calls this way of seeing petitionary prayer, like only asking God when things get really bad, or only asking for big things, as a false spirituality. And I was like, wow, that's a kind of an interesting way of saying it. He kind of flips it upside down and says petitionary prayer needs to remain primary throughout our lives because we are forever dependent on God. Like, whether we acknowledge it or not, we are all completely dependent on God. And so this posture of asking for everything should be the norm. Now, I don't know how it's for you, but I think generally, I can say this, I can speak generally for most of us, most of humanity, to acknowledge that we are dependent or feeble or weak is not something that we generally like to do. And I think most of us, we don't like to acknowledge this truth. I think this is why, it can be really hard to give up our autonomy, right? I know that like this can be a struggle when you have like parents or that are struggling with like, well, I don't have my capabilities anymore, so maybe I shouldn't drive, and then I have to like ask for people to help. I know that like that can be a really big struggle, or admitting that you need to go live in a care home and like sell your house. Like these are real things. And I think it's a struggle because most of us don't want to acknowledge our dependence because what do? Like the cycle of life is that we start out as independent little babies that can't do anything for ourselves, completely dependent on other people. But then the role of maturity is that we become independent people. So we don't need to ask for other people for help. That we can, and then we move into the next phase of then we have other people dependent on us, right? But then we have to realize then we become dependent again. But the truth of the matter is that, like, while that's the human cycle, our spiritual lives, we're forever dependent on God. That our independence is really an illusion. Because and in this phase of life as adults, we don't like to admit that we don't have it all together and we're unable to ultimately take care of ourselves. But rather than seeing this as a bad thing, my hope is this morning is to encourage us to embrace lives of petitionary prayers, where we not only ask for big things, and we don't only ask for things when we're in trouble, but we begin to ask like all sorts of things all the time. And that we become unafraid to come to God with any and all of our needs and our wants and our requests. And there's good news in this. There's good news to like embrace this sort of behavior or this kind of prayer life. And I think this is why. When we start to live in this kind of prayer life, we begin to recognize, one, our vulnerability and our empty-handedness for our daily basic needs, from things like parking spaces to medications to kitchen table wisdom that we need to know how to like responsibly care for our children or our grandchildren. That when we do this, then we are invited into a richer form of spirituality where we have less anxiety and more trust in God, right? And we have more relationship. And so the first point I want to look at here is that when we practice petitionary prayer, we begin to learn that we are loved more by God than we could expect or deserve. Well, I think there's a danger. I think that there's certainly a danger to pray to only get things from God, right? This is the danger of treating God like a genie or a vending machine. I think in some ways is actually more preferred, because I think it is an error of naivety, because you will quickly come to know in reality that you'll be quickly disabused of treating God that way, because he just won't answer those sorts of prayers, right? And he won't you just won't get everything that you want, and then you kind of have to deal with it. Now that could lead to its own sort of like spiritual crisis that I don't want to say that's not real, or it can be difficult, but I don't think most of us struggle in that regard. I think that like as we continue to grow, that kind of sorts itself out. I think the greater danger, and I think this is the greater tendency here, is of only practicing prayer when we want something big or when we're especially desperate. Like asking for healing when we get a cancer diagnosis, or prayer for a job when we lose our jobs, but tend to forget God when life is easy, like I said earlier. And I think that this is where most of us live at most of the time. We think that and I think that underneath it all, it comes with like, I don't really want to bother God right now. I think I can handle it. Like I got it. And with this, I think then with this approach to prayer, we kind of approach God like an ER doctor, right? Rather than our primary care physician. So it's not good to just like, if you're like, we need to go to the doctor all the time, right? We need to get regular checkups. We need to check our blood panel. Like you have a relationship, and not everything's an emergency. And if you try to like, and if you don't ever get any sort of medical treatment, outside of like an emergency room, it's just not going to you're not going to be very healthy, right? And the truth of the matter is God wants to be there in our lives, not only when things are tough, but when things are good, right? And while it might seem, and while this whole approach to prayer may seem, superficially pious at first, I think it's actually born from a skepticism, and I think it's a false front of a wounded heart. I think that all of us we start out with prayer, we kind of treat God like the vending machine, and then we quickly realize that doesn't work, and then we're just kind of wounded, and then skepticism comes in, and it's like I think I heard every skeptic is actually just a wounded idealist. And I think that there's a part of us that really wants to pray, believe that God's going to answer our prayers, but then we've been wounded too many times and we're like, I'm just not going to ask. And I think that at the core of it, why we don't ask in the first place for silly things like parking spots as much as well as big things, is that the question in our mind, we wonder, does God really love me enough and to care about the petty details of my life? Does God care about the little petty details of my life? Because surely maybe he loves other people in other places more than me. So when we fail to ask God for the daily stuff of our lives, I think it reveals doubts and questions that we have about God and his character in our own lives. And I think that the real question that we wrestle with is, does God really care about me at all? Does God really care about me at all? And here I think we just really profoundly miss the heart of our Father. And because I think in one sense, nothing is more important to him than the little daily anxieties and worries and cares that we have. Our common concerns around, say, the burdens of our aging bodies, or the frustration we have when our children are acting up, or the kind of the daily stresses at work and that passive-aggressive coworker who makes signs about cleaning the microwave but doesn't actually clean it, or even just your worries and concerns about the road conditions for your upcoming vacation. And even though that might seem silly because you're like, wow, I'm blessed enough to go on a vacation, it's still real, and God cares for us more. And scriptures tell us that God the Father cares for us more than the sparrows of the field or the lilies of the valley, yet he's daily attentive to their needs. And animals and plants that may seem insignificant to us, God cares about them infinitely more than we could care about them. So how much so more would he care about us who are in his image? Richard Foster calls this kind of orientation also a false humility, to stand back and to not share our needs. And that, I think he boldly claims that this wounds the heart of God by our reticence. And I kind of was taking a step back, and there's kind of you could go down a whole theological track with that. But I think the heart behind it is a good one. And I see this in my own life. Just as I long for my children to share their petty details of their days, I know for me, it's if I pick Ezra up from school or ask him about his day, I want to know all the little things that happened at school. I want to know the books that he's reading, who he's playing with at lunch, what games did he play, what silly games or inside jokes that he has with his friends. But then if I pick him up and I was like, how's your day, Ezra? And he's like, fine. So, did you learn anything? No. What are you reading? Just the normal stuff. It's just this shut. I'm like, what are you doing? Math, fractions? Oh yeah, fractions. It's easy. And I'm like, you're not giving me a lot to work with here. And I'm only asking those things because I want a relationship, right? Did you know that people have studied this, that the bulk of our conversations have no content in them? We're not the bulk of our conversation isn't deep, profound conversations around, politics or philosophy or theology. It's mostly the things like our groceries, what we had for dinner. Like I know, like I call my mom, and the things that we talk about are just are boring. It's like, what'd you have for dinner? But also, those little details make up the intimacies of our lives. That's kind of like the basis where we can start then building on other things. That like you need to spend like 90% of that small talk, and it creates the relationship over time. It kind of creates the foundation, because if you just only know like a person's ideas, you don't know their heart, right? And I think that that's what God's after when he's calling us, teaching us to pray, give us this day our daily bread, to ask us for the things, is to initiate a relationship with our Father in heaven. So we don't go from being like, I'm fine, school is fine, to being like, yeah, I had like this thing that was going on, and I like this was this fun thing that happened, and then we grow in our intimacy. When we live lives characterized by this sort of daily petitionary prayer, we open ourselves up to deeper intimacy with God. And I think this is the thing, it's the kind that we crave. This is the thing that like we want to have, that like deep intimacy with God. But I think we're too afraid to often engage in it because we fear that it won't be received, that our prayers won't be received, that God won't answer our prayers. And so we kind of like hedge our bets and be like, if I don't say anything, then God can't answer my prayers. And if God doesn't answer my prayers, then I won't be disappointed that he doesn't love me. And I have noticed that like when I have prayed, even for like small things, and I think it's also really easy to be like, Beatrice prayed that prayer, right? Of like getting the parking spot. One could go, well, that was just a coincidence. But maybe it wasn't, right? I think that we're so quick to rationalize all this stuff away, rather than just being like, oh, there's like God working in my life in this like small little way. Not in a big way, but maybe that was a thing. And I think we're just so quick to just want to like rationalize all that stuff away and just be kind of like, well, that was just a coincidence, and like, people are always leaving, and it's just happened. I don't think it just happened. There's a part of me that wants to just kind of be like, because the thing is, if I can just rationalize it away, it's like, well, then I'm still in control, right? But then when we rationalize it away, we also lose the relationship. Do you see the trade-off? So this leads me to my next point. Not only does petitionary prayer lead us into a deeper relationship with God, it also frees us from the anxieties of our life. By daily recognizing our daily dependence on God, it shatters the illusion of control, and when it occurs, it can free us from the relentless anxiety that we have that's characterized by our modern lives. One of the funny things, I don't know if you've ever like paid attention to the words. I think that's one of these prayers that we probably a lot of us have memorized, and so they just kind of like form the backdrop of things that we've memorized over the years. But the funny thing about this prayer is it really drives home the day part. Give us this day our daily bread. That seems like really kind of like a lot of like, in a really short prayer, Jesus is putting a lot of emphasis on the dailiness of it. And here I think what Jesus is doing is he's giving us a little nod to the story of the Exodus. Now, I know normally when I'm like preaching, I'll be like, now let's turn our Bibles to Genesis chapter 1, maybe Genesis chapter 2 if I'm feeling saucy. This time, we're going to go back to the book of Exodus. And this is actually true. While most of the main themes in the Bible kind of emerge from Genesis chapters 1 through 3, probably the second most important story, or the second biggest area where we get themes and patternings as well, is the story of the Exodus. Just a little shout out, the Bible Project is doing a whole series on this. So this is like, they know what they're talking about here. But Exodus is a foundational story. This is where we get This is where we get the words redemption and salvation the first time. So that's important, right? Which is like, we talk about these things quite often. But the Exodus story, like, we might think of the Exodus story because of things like the Prince of Egypt and the Charlton Heston movie, the Ten Commandments. We might only think of it with the first half, where you have the children of Israel suffering under the oppression of Pharaoh. And then God brings the plagues, and then they are dramatically saved through the Red Sea, and then, off they go. And we kind of stop there. That's kind of where we, like, in our minds, we just kind of go, okay, story's over. However, that's only part one of the Exodus story. There's two other parts. There is the wandering in the wilderness section, which takes up a huge section. And then you get into going into the land itself. So those are kind of the three major beats of the story. And in the middle, in the wilderness wandering period, and this becomes a very foundational part of kind of later biblical stories, we get the story of manna and God's provision of manna in the wilderness. And we did this in our Exodus series. So, like, if you remember this, there was, this is like Exodus. I don't have it in my notes. It's going to be, oh man, I'm going to fail here. It's like Exodus 16, the manna. 16, okay, oh yes. Oh, I'm really bad at scripture memorization, so that makes me feel really good. So it's so this is the story where God is testing the people of Israel, but also providing for their needs. Because, right, they first have the test of water where they're like, God brought us out here to die, we're all dying of thirst, and then God miraculously provides them a pool of water through a tree. Now they're complaining of food. They're like, God brought us out into the desert, we have nothing to eat, we're all starving to death, you hate us, what are you going to do, God? And then God's like going to be like, okay, I got you. I'm going to provide this magical sky bread, heaven, bread of angels come down. And so, and here's the rules, though. Every day you need to gather just enough for what you need that day. And this is key. Anything that's left over or hoarded will become incredibly molded and gross and filled with maggots, and you can't eat that stuff. And then there's also there's a subtle other detail added here that says that those who gathered too little ended up they ended up actually having enough, and that there's like kind of a miracle that their jars were filled up anyway, and so that they were miraculously provided for if they didn't get enough. And that there's a part of you that's like, so like somebody didn't work hard enough and they still got some? Like, come on. But the point being here is that God provided for their daily need. But this is the part, but just enough for that day. And then every day they had to do the same thing. They had to gather enough manna just for that day. And then the Sabbath was a special one where they had to gather twice as much because they're going to take a day off. And then those who went out and didn't find anything, they had problems. And and this is a foundational story, and it's a profound meditation on God's provision, as well as a test, and this is key, whether they will trust God and let go of their control. Will they trust God to provide for their needs? Will they trust God enough to provide for them, or will they seek to procure for themselves their daily sustenance? And this becomes a test for the Sabbath. And this is key. And it kind of hits into this deep human tendency of we want control, and even though that we are dependent on God, we want to seek for ourselves our own provision. This prayer, give us this day our daily bread, isn't merely asking God for things. It's really an assault on the strong lie that deceives our souls that we are in control. Our desire for control, I think, ultimately comes from a good place, right? What good is control? Well, it's the desire to provide and to positively use our strength and our power, right? If you think about this in an agricultural setting, it's farm labor is challenging, right? And so it's a positive use of energy and strength to plow a field, to scatter wheat, to eat, and then even to provide. So then you provide for your family, and then also it comes with using the same, like having diligence and wisdom to know that you're not overeating, so that they can't just go to a supermarket and to like get their stuff. And all of this work, all of this labor, all of this energy, it gives us this truth. We want to have meaning, and this gives us meaning. It gives us purpose in our life when we do this, because it gives us a sense of like that we have a place in the world. We can make a difference. Yet, when we seek this desire apart from God, things quickly go sideways for humanity. And we end up, I think what ends up happening is we end up becoming exhausted, burnt out, and anxious. And I don't think that it's a coincidence that we live in an age that does not practice Sabbath very well, or practice this idea of like kind of a radical dependence on God in the rhythm of our life. And we also live in some of the most stressed out, anxious world. Like there used to be laws in our country. This is like kind of crazy how like things just used to shut down on Sundays. Like not too long ago, that was like a thing that happened. And you know what? Society worked. Like the factory shut down for making fabric. We didn't run out of fabric, right? It's okay you didn't get your mail on Sunday. It also didn't matter if your Amazon package was one day later. And then this provided for people to spend time with their family. And even if you weren't religious, it provided you could spend time with your family. You could rest. There was a secular benefit to Sabbath that allowed for things of like communal goods, and like then you could all plan to go bowling together, and there was like all these things that were benefits of this. People were able to like relax and chill out, and I think it led to people being less anxious overall. It's one consequence. But now we don't live in that world. We live in hustle culture and the grind, and always working 2 or 3 jobs, and trying to eke out as much economic stuff we can, and because we can never rest that God's just going to like help us provide for my need for tomorrow. And then what ends up happening is we become trapped in this kind of thinking where it's an endless rat race, need to work more and harder, and never being able to say enough. And this is precisely why the manna was given. It was a test to see, this is the ultimate key. The key here is, would they trust God and learn to just have enough? And because the worry was, if I don't get enough, then how am I going to live, right? And this was incredibly important, because this was to learn how to rest after generations of slavery, right? They had been programmed, essentially, that they always had to work. And so then when they couldn't do that anymore, like that would be a profoundly challenging thing, I think. And I think it's really profoundly challenging to us, too, like just to be like, we're not going to do, we have enough, or God's going to provide for us. We face similar challenges. And we believe, I believe often, it's simply like I think ultimately it's like, it comes down to, I just need to figure things out on my own. But we fail to remember that every good and perfect gift comes from our Father above. And when we establish a daily practice of asking things for God, both big and little, I think we'll be surprised how he will answer and how much we will actually begin to trust him more when we let him. And it is his desire that we find rest in him. This is his, and then in one of the Psalms reflecting on this period of like the wandering desert years, they said that they rebel against God, and then God says they will not enter into my rest. And you're like, when at Meribah and Massa, I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, they challenged me. And he's like reflecting back on these stories, and they're like, they will not enter into my rest. And it's like it's a profound challenge, being like, will I rest in God? And I want to point out this Sabbath was God's idea, and he practiced it. But Jesus reminds us that Sabbath was made for man, right? This was God's gift for us, not man for the Sabbath. So it's not like this oppressive tool, right? Which there was, that was kind of a pendulum reaction on one side in Jesus' day. But I think we are more on the opposite end, where we don't practice it at all. And we can begin to practice Sabbath and rest by asking God for things. Because it helps us stay, and I think this is the point, staying presently oriented rather than future oriented. Like, how do we do this? When we pray for our daily needs, we're not focusing so much on the future and all of its contingencies. I think that if you're an anxious person, you live in the future. You don't actually live in the present. And so then you don't actually live, because you're always thinking about all the other things that could happen, but even though you have right now. And I think when we ask God for our daily needs, we can learn to live in the presence and trust in God's provision, because we're not learning just as his provision, but his sovereignty. Because when you talk about your daily needs, you're trusting your future to God. And I think that's where we let go of the control, and that gives us freedom. So this week, I want to encourage you to start practicing petitionary prayer. Start asking God for things, small things, big things, and everything kind of in between, so that you can focus in growing your relationship with the Lord, feeling his love for you, but also learning to trust in his sovereignty and to rest and just kind of let go of the control just a little bit. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this prayer in your word. I pray that you would allow us to start practicing these petitionary prayers in our lives. Help us to carve out space each day to say one prayer to you about our day and to move forward in the morning, and help us start to practice it, even if it feels silly. But let it become a discipline for us so that we can love you. And in Jesus' name, amen.